Every evening at exactly 5:30, Eleanor Whitmore sat by the front door. Not because she expected a delivery or feared she might forget something if she moved away from it, but because once, a long time ago, 5:30 had meant her family was coming home. And even though the world had changed and the house had quieted and the years had softened her body but sharpened her memory, she never stopped believing that maybe one day, somehow, they would walk through that door again. And the clock on the wall ticked gently as it always had, each second landing with the same patience Eleanor had learned to practice. And when she sat there, she did not think of herself as waiting so much as remembering. Because memory, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like expectation. And expectation can feel like hope if you hold it carefully. And in her mind she could still see the house as it once was 30 years earlier, when it was alive in a way that now felt almost impossible to explain. When footsteps echoed down the hallway, school bags landed wherever they happened to fall, laughter spilled from the kitchen. And her husband Richard sat at the table pretending to read the newspaper while listening to every sound his children made. And at 5:30 sharp, the door would burst open, and voices would collide with one another as if competing for space. "Mom, we're home," they would shout. And Eleanor would smile without realizing she was smiling because joy did not require awareness back then, it simply arrived. And dinner every night at 6 was non-negotiable in her home because Eleanor believed in routine with a quiet intensity, believing that routine meant return, that habits pulled people back, even when the world tried to scatter them. And those evenings were full of stories and arguments and homework complaints and laughter that rose and fell without reason. And Eleanor believed then, without ever questioning it, that this was how life worked, that love showed up on time, that families naturally orbited one another, and that the door was not something you waited beside but something that refused to stay closed. And even when small frustrations crept in, when voices grew louder or tempers shorter, she never feared loss because presence felt permanent. But time is patient and unannounced in its work. And it began by changing small things first. Like the sound of the house when the children grew older, when backpacks became briefcases, when dinners became rushed, when conversations shortened. And then one night Richard went to bed beside her and did not wake up, passing quietly in his sleep without warning or drama, leaving Eleanor to wake to a silence that felt too large for one person. And the children came then, they came quickly, filling the house again with footsteps and grief and planning. And Eleanor moved through those days like someone holding something fragile inside her chest, careful not to drop it. And after the funeral, they left again, returning to their lives, promising to call, promising to visit. And Eleanor believed them because belief was easier than fear. And the house grew quieter, not all at once, but year by year. Daniel moving to another city for work and speaking with excitement about opportunity. Claire marrying and relocating and learning how to become someone's wife, while Eleanor learned how to be someone who watched from afar. Michael traveling abroad and speaking of time zones as if they were temporary obstacles rather than distances that stretched years thin. And Eleanor adapted without protest, keeping the same habits even when the reasons behind them faded. Sitting by the door at 5:30 with knitting she did not always work on, listening more than doing, holding the phone nearby even when it did not ring. And calls became shorter, visits rarer, apologies more frequent. "Sorry Mom, busy this weekend, next month for sure." And Eleanor never complained because complaining felt like burdening. And she did not want to be something her children had to carry. So she said "I understand," and meant it, and did not mean it all at once. Because understanding does not erase longing, it simply gives it a place to sit quietly. And she waited not because she was lonely but because love, in her heart, had a schedule. Because 5:30 still lived inside her as a promise, even when the world no longer honored it. And then one winter evening the rain fell heavy and cold, tapping against the windows with an insistence that matched the pressure in her chest as Eleanor struggled slightly to breathe. Dismissing it at first because dismissing discomfort had become a habit too. and she reached for the phone and called Daniel. No answer. Claire texted that she was in a meeting. Michael was asleep somewhere far away, where time no longer aligned. And Eleanor sat by the door anyway, pulling her sweater tighter, telling herself they must be stuck in traffic, that something had delayed them. Because belief, when practiced long enough, becomes instinct. And the clock reached 5:30, and she whispered to the empty hallway, as if someone might hear her, that they must be on their way. And hours passed and the house grew colder and quieter until sleep overtook her in the chair, her head tilting forward, her body finally giving in to exhaustion it had learned to hide. And the next morning a neighbor found her on the floor. Not dramatic, not tragic in the way stories are told. Just weakness, dehydration, time catching up. And the hospital room was quiet, but the impact was loud. Because for the first time her children were forced to see her not as the constant she had always been, but as something fragile. Something that could be lost without warning. And they gathered again in the old house while Eleanor recovered. Walking through rooms that felt smaller than memory had promised. Noticing things they had never really seen before, their childhood height marks on the wall, their father's coat still hanging where he left it. The chair by the door worn not by age alone but by years of waiting. And Claire asked softly why she sat there every day. And Eleanor smiled gently because bitterness had never learned how to live in her voice. And she said that this was where the happiest part of her day used to begin. And the silence that followed was not empty but heavy with realization. Daniel stepping outside, overwhelmed by memories of rushing past her as a teenager. Michael staring at the door as if seeing it for the first time, and all of them understanding at once that she had not been waiting for the future but holding on to the past, that every evening she had been sitting inside a memory rather than a moment. And guilt arrived not as accusation but as grief. Grief for all the times they had been absent without realizing absence could wound quietly. And a week later, when Eleanor returned home and sat by the door again at 5:25, the house felt different, expectant in a way she had not felt in years. And then a car pulled up, then another, then another. And at 5:30 the door opened, and voices filled the hallway. "Mom, we're home." And the sound broke something open inside her chest that she had kept carefully sealed. And the house came alive again, not permanently, not perfectly, but honestly. And Daniel knelt beside her chair, promising they could not be there every day, but they could call at 5:30. Claire adding they would visit more. Michael gently moving her chair and suggesting that next time she sit in the living room and they would come find her. And Eleanor laughed softly, because laughter, she realized, still remembered how to live in her. And later that evening she sat at the dining table, surrounded by noise and movement and stories that overlapped. The door closing in the background without significance for the first time in years. And Eleanor understood then that she had never really been waiting by the door for someone to come. She had been honoring the love that once filled her life. And love, once formed, never truly leaves. It simply waits to be acknowledged again. And as the clock ticked forward, and the night settled gently around the house, Eleanor felt at peace, not because everything was restored, but because something essential had been remembered. And that was enough, because sometimes home is not a place you return to every day, but a feeling you must not forget to visit. And she hoped, quietly, that if her children remembered nothing else, they would remember that someone once waited for them. Faithfully, patiently, at exactly 5:30, believing they were worth waiting for. And in the days that followed, that evening, Eleanor found herself waking with a different weight in her chest, not lighter exactly, but warmer. As though something that had long been held apart had finally been allowed to rest where it belonged. And she noticed how the house responded to this change. How the silence no longer felt like abandonment, but like breathing space. How the ticking of the clock sounded less like counting and more like accompaniment. And she still sat near the door sometimes, not out of habit but out of affection, touching the arm of the chair as one might touch the shoulder of an old friend, remembering without clinging. And when 5:30 arrived, she no longer felt the sharp intake of hope that once bordered on pain, but a softer anticipation that accepted whatever the moment brought. And the phone rang more often now, sometimes exactly on time, sometimes late, sometimes early, but always with voices that lingered rather than rushed. Voices that asked questions and waited for answers. And Eleanor learned that presence could travel through sound just as meaningfully as it once traveled through footsteps. And she began to tell stories she had never told before. Stories she had saved for someday without realizing someday had already passed. Stories about Richard's quiet humor, about the small fears she once had as a young mother pretending confidence, about mistakes she had made and lessons she learned too late to teach but not too late to share. And her children listened differently now. Not because they had changed entirely, but because awareness had widened their attention. And they heard in her voice not obligation, but history, not routine, but resilience. And Eleanor realized that waiting had not been wasted time after all. Because waiting had shaped her patience, and patience had shaped her love. And love, though once silent, had finally been heard. And when grandchildren asked why she liked sitting near the door, she told them it was because doors reminded her that life was always moving, always opening and closing, and that what mattered was not how often people came and went, but that they knew where they belonged. And as seasons passed, Eleanor grew slower, but not smaller, gentler, but not weaker, and she no longer feared the sound of evening settling in. Because evenings were no longer empty spaces she had to fill alone. And when she sat at the dining table now, surrounded or sometimes simply remembered, she felt complete in a way that did not depend on numbers. And she understood at last that love does not disappear when routines break. It waits quietly until someone is brave enough to notice it again. And if anyone were to ask her whether she regretted all those years spent sitting by the door, Eleanor would smile and say no, because waiting had been her way of loving, and loving, even when unseen, is never truly wasted. And at exactly 5:30, no matter where her children were in the world, something inside them paused now, a small inherited instinct, a gentle reminder of a door, a chair, a woman who believed in return, and that pause, that remembering, was enough to carry her love forward long after the clock continued its patient ticking.